Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen. This will be part 6 in our ongoing multi-episode mini-series. We dusted this one off from our archives because it's a perfect fit for the one we did last week with Dr. Robin Faith Walsh. Robin gave us a glimpse into what the academics in the ivory tower of theology are saying, or perhaps I should use the word debating, in their conversation about the authoring of the 4 canonical Gospels. In fact, she presented her newest book on the topic, her thesis that the Gospels were written by highly educated Greco-Roman elites, who used and reformulated the ideas, the tropes, and vocabulary and writing styles that were available in Greek novels, philosophical texts, and biographies at that time, to produce what could in some ways be described as Christian pop fiction of the 2nd century. In the process of reconceptualizing the Gospels in this way, as the cultural creative product of 2nd century Greco-Roman Christians, and even wondering if this might mean that the Gospel accounts are myths, I was reminded of an episode I released a couple years ago, an interview I did with another literary scholar well before Scott had joined the podcast team. My guest that day told me about conversations had between J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both of them giants in the arena of myth creation and pop fiction, and those conversations resulted in the religious conversion of Lewis to Protestant Christianity, and their conclusion that Christianity is not just myth, but it's true myth. I'll let my guest from 4 years ago explain what they meant by that. I re-listened to this episode myself a couple weeks ago, and I remembered how much I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. It was like a roller coaster ride. I guarantee that this episode will stir you. I think most of you will enjoy it, even though it might conjure up big questions for you. And there might be some of you who strongly dislike it, possibly because it raises some philosophical challenges for you as well. Either way, let me know what you think. So strap in, sit back, keep your arms inside the car, and enjoy the ride. Over the past few weeks, we've looked at the origin of Judaism, one of the earliest human religions, and at Christianity, which evolved out of that. But we did those episodes right after several others that focused on hominids evolving a set of cognitive abilities and behaviors that motivate them, that incline them toward inventing religions. That might mislead some listeners to think or conclude that Judaism and Christianity are just simply 2 more of many religions that humans have concocted, that there's nothing true about them, they just simply make for a great story that brings comfort. That wasn't my intention, but I can see how you get there. I can also imagine certain other listeners saying, okay, Christianity may be one of the many religions, but it's the only true religion. I wasn't too happy with the division that this conversation might be creating, either in the minds of individuals or between individuals. But as circumstances would have it, right around that time when I was finalizing the last few episodes, one of my favorite podcasts, Unbelievable with Justin Brierley and Premier Christian Radio, they had just released an episode about J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis talking about myths and literature, ancient literature as well as modern writings. This was their area of scholarly expertise. And it was this discussion which convinced Lewis to embrace Christianity as the true myth, in quotation marks, a fulfillment of all the other human-invented myths. It's worth saying here that myths are the bricks of many of the world's religions. Myths are stories which attempt to describe the world as it really is. Many listeners might have the wrong idea about myths because they misunderstand the meaning of that word. They think the meaning of the word myth, the Oxford Dictionary meaning, is a widely held but false belief or idea. That may be the popular meaning, but not what scholars mean when they use the word. It's like the word theory. Scientists use the word to mean a whole package of data and facts and interpretations which are explained by a core idea. Gravitational theory, cell theory, acid-base theory, quantum theory. That's how scientists understand the word theory. But many non-scientists think the word theory means a guess, a hunch, a possibility. So, back to this word myth. Humans have always been creating myths. We see this all the way back to our earliest glimpses of recorded history. Babylon created the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describes interactions between gods and humans and has a creation account that sounds an awful lot like Genesis. They also have a heart-rending story of Gilgamesh trying to make his way into the underworld, the world of the dead, in order to be reunited with his best friend Enkidu. I was surprised at how moving that story was when I read it, given how it's literally thousands of years old and coming from a civilization that's so very different from my own, and yet is still so able to evoke emotions. Egypt created myths of Osiris and Horus and many others, also complete with their own creation narratives and stories of the origin of humans. The ancient Jews who came from both of those civilizations have mythic stories of a Yahweh who interacts with Israel, leads them as a nation out of Egypt with fabulous miracles. Buddhists created a belief system around a being who reaches enlightenment and attains forms of cosmic divine proportions. Muslims have a story of Muhammad flying a winged horse to the moon and splitting it, and Christians, of course, have stories of Christ performing miracles, like walking on water, turning water to wine, and raising people from the dead. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. I'm not meaning to mock any of these religions or their stories, but simply to point out that stories like these have been around in every part of the globe for thousands of years. And this kind of myth-making is not simply an ancient or primitive thing that we modern humans have outgrown. Myth-making continues into the modern era. The Lone Ranger, Tarzan, Guardians of the Universe. Movies like Prometheus, Contact, Star Wars, and Star Trek. Characters like James Bond, Ethan Hunt in the Mission Impossible series, Jack Reacher. And if you don't think that these modern myths don't influence the way people see the world, their private thoughts and their subconscious thoughts, and even some of their actions in life, I think quite differently. At first, all these stories look quite different because we focus too much on the details of the stories. Like true modernists, guided by science, we get hung up on the cosmetics and the minutiae, the names and faces, the costumes and dimensions, the specific actions performed rather than the motivations behind those actions. But when you look deeper behind the stories, the message they're trying to convey, what they're saying about human nature, about morals and values, and about destiny, you'll notice that there are recurring themes. The story of a hero who arises out of ordinary circumstances to become a superpower, and who rights the wrongs that he sees in the world around him. Hercules, Prometheus, Robin Hood, the knight in shining armor, the Lone Ranger riding into the sunset, Batman, Spider-Man, John Connor in the Terminator series. Or the story of the struggle against mortality, the search for immortality and eternal youth. So there's Gilgamesh and his encounter with Utnapishtim in the ancient Babylonian era, and in the modern era you have Blade Runner and Benjamin Button and Ex Machina. The story of someone who tried to grasp too high for power or fame or wealth or importance. For the ancient Greeks, there's Icarus who flew too close to the sun. In the Bible, the Tower of Babel. While Hollywood shows us Michael Douglas in the movie Greed, Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf of Wall Street, and so many other movies about billionaires and dictators. There's the story of someone being separated from their family and their home and having to go on a long, difficult journey to make their way back. Odysseus of Greek mythology, Robinson Crusoe, Tom Hanks in Castaway, Tom Hanks in Apollo 13, Tom Hanks in Saving Private Ryan. Or the familiar story of created beings rising up against their creators and trying to destroy them. The Sumerians were first on the block here, telling about gods making humans out of dirt, then deciding to drown them in a flood, but one of those gods, Enki, warning them how to escape the flood by building a boat. The ancient Greeks created a similar myth of humans being made from the dirt and being helped by Prometheus. Thousands of years later, Hollywood creates the cinema myth of Prometheus, humans rediscovering the super race that created them and finding it necessary to destroy that super race. Which sounds an awful lot like the movie Contact, based on Carl Sagan's movie and starring Jodie Foster. And again, Blade Runner, in which Harrison Ford tracks down the robots that just want to survive in a dystopian human future. These are some of the many existential themes that we humans have been struggling with for millennia. We've always been making up myths, always been on this cosmic search trying to build our stairways to heaven. A need to believe in a bigger story, something bigger than us. It seems to be built into us. Why is that? Does it confer some kind of an evolutionary advantage for survival or reproduction? Or could that have been put into us, instilled in us, a built-in hunger that drives us to search for something? J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the leading experts on literature and narrative and myth-making, and the one who brought us the blockbuster modern myth Lord of the Rings, he asked whether these myths point toward one true myth, a story that sounds too good to be real and yet is real. I was intrigued when I heard about this and I thought I had to find out more. To answer this question, I did some searching and asking around for a scholar who's wrestled with this question in particular. And I found an ideal candidate. Dr. Louis Markos has his MA and PhD in English language and literature from the University of Michigan and is now professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. His area of expertise includes C.S. Lewis, apologetics, and ancient Greece and Rome. He's put out dozens of books, academic papers, and lecture videos on YouTube, and lectures widely in schools and conferences around the globe. I'd like to read this excerpt from his faculty page at HBU. His goal is to fuse into a single stream the humanist strivings of Athens and the Christian truths of Jerusalem. Believing that all truth is God's truth, Dr. Markos seeks to measure all human knowledge against the touchstone of Orthodox Christian doctrine. Believing further that Christianity is not the only truth but the only complete truth, he seeks to discover in cultures, mythologies, religions, and philosophies of the ancient and modern world intimations and foreshadowings of the greater truths revealed in Christ and the Bible. As I often say on this podcast, I couldn't have found a better expert for this topic than the person we now have on the microphone across from me. Dr. Markos, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Luke. I'm excited to talk about myth.
And I'm so glad you took up the invitation to spend an hour with me on this topic. Before I brought you on, I told the listeners about how humans have been creating myths since the dawn of time. We can see that in the most ancient of texts that we have access to, and we have physical evidence of it all around the globe for the past 5,000 years. And now we even see it today in our blockbuster movies and best-selling novels. Why do you think that we humans do that?
I'll tell you, Luke, I don't know if I read this somewhere or made it up myself. My favorite definition for a myth is each of us individually has dreams. But I believe that when a whole nation or a whole tribe dreams together, you end up with a myth. We are myth-making animals. We tell stories. We live through stories. And some of those stories are best captured in what are called archetypes or archetypal figures. Now, one of the great modern people to do that was Joseph Campbell, who had a profound influence on George Lucas, who, when he made Star Wars, imbued it with all of these archetypes. An archetype is a recurring theme, a recurring character, a recurring story type that not only appears, say, in Europe, but is cross-cultural. We see it all over the world. We see it in different traditions. We see it at different times. And the best way to kick this off, Luke, is by looking at your name. Because Luke Skywalker is the perfect embodiment of what's called the foundling myth. This is the young boy, sometimes young girl, but it's often a boy, who is in some way or another of royal blood. But he ends up growing up as a poor boy amongst fishermen or amongst shepherds. And over the course of the story, he comes to know who he is and steps into his inheritance. So all of the greatest Greek heroes, Theseus, Hercules, Jason, and Perseus, are all foundlings. All of them are either the son of a god or the son of a king, and yet they're raised as a pauper, and they have to come into their own and show their legacy, that they are blue-blooded. So that's Luke Skywalker, but it's also Harry Potter, it's D'Artagnan, it's Tarzan, it's Romulus and Remus, it's King Cyrus, it's Moses, and supremely it's Jesus, the Son of God, raised as the son of a carpenter. And I think that all of us resonate. And I think the reason why the original Star Wars trilogy is so much better than anything else is because the original, focusing on Joseph Campbell, is pulling on all the different archetypes. And so it speaks to us on a deep cross-cultural level.
So you gave us one example, the foundling myth. Give us a couple others just so people have an idea of what we're referring to when we talk about myths, ancient and modern, Hollywood myths.
One of my favorites, the foundling is always a good boy. You know, he always ends up the hero. But the best and most ubiquitous, I think, of the evil archetypes comes later to be known as the Byronic hero, because Lord Byron wrote about them. But they go all the way back to Satan. Okay, the Byronic hero is a person who in the beginning is fairly good, but at some point in his life, he comes to a crossroad. And what he ends up doing in one way or another is selling his soul for some kind of forbidden wisdom or forbidden power. And they get that power or that wisdom by committing a taboo sin, and it gives them power, but ends up cutting them off from their humanity and other human beings. So Satan is the original Byronic hero, but Adam, who eats of the forbidden fruit, fits in that. Cain fits in that, who ends up with a mark cut off from his fellow man. Darth Vader, of course, is a perfect example of that. Most of the heroes in Wagner are Byronic heroes. The Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Frankenstein. Oftentimes they're doing it to help man. They want to defeat death, let's say. But in doing that, they step out of the human circle and they can no longer go back to the farm. If we go back again to Star Wars, another very popular archetype is the wise old man. So whether it's Obi-Wan Kenobi or Dumbledore or Gandalf, it's the wise man who trains. Often he's actually training the foundling, not always, but he's training the young man. And you see this in Japanese stories as well, and the sensei, the wise man, that leave in something like the Seven Samurai. You see these same archetypes again and again. Well, one more, again, if we're thinking about Star Wars, Han Solo is the pirate who ends up being civilized, right? He's the rough survivor, but often because he meets the princess. So princess and the pirate is also something that goes together. But he is the person that starts by only looking out for number one, but he discovers a nobility within him that allows him to rise up and be a hero. And I think there's a little bit of us in all of these archetypes. And I think that's why we're drawn to them again and again. By the way, Byronic hero, almost every villain in Lord of the Rings is a Byronic hero. They all started well, but Saruman, Sauron, Gollum, and the Black Riders are all people that, to a certain extent, lose their humanity in their lust for something forbidden. The ring.
Right. So all of these that you've mentioned are all characters in myths, but I also thought there were archetypal myths. So for example, or storylines, I should say. So for example, the search for immortality, or people who are trapped or enslaved or kidnapped in some way and they need a hero, a redeemer of some kind.
Good. That really is, the hero with 1,000 faces, and Joseph Campbell says. So everybody's favorite archetypal journey is the quest. And I mean, you mentioned it right there when it's the quest for immortality, the quest for knowledge, the search for the Holy Grail. In the Western world, the original search would be Jason and the Argonauts, the search for the Holy Fleece, Golden Fleece, which actually gives you power and it's healing. It often gives you immortality. So all of these people are searching for that. And, along the way, they're often helped by heroes. Sometimes they're helped by three different things, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Oftentimes, on their journey, they do a good deed, sometimes to man, but sometimes it's a good deed to nature, and that gets them the help they need to continue on their journey. But you're right, the archetypal journey of the Exodus, of the road out of slavery, the road out of bondage. And what's fascinating, at least in my country, speaking here in the South part, it's interesting that in our country, both the Puritans and the Black slaves both identified with the exodus of the Jews out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Obviously, for the Jews, for the Blacks, it was out of slavery, but for the Puritans, it was that search for a religious freedom that they were seeking to find. And so they came here as well. And again, they speak to us because I think all of us partake in that. Sometimes there's the journey for it's sort of, okay, I'm the foundling, right? And I have challenged in some way your authority. You're an evil king. And so you put me on an impossible quest. You don't want to kill me because you'll bring blood guilt on yourself. So instead, you send me to get the golden fleece. Or Perseus is told to get the head of Medusa that turns you to stone. They're not supposed to survive. It's supposed to kill them. But they're that archetypal foundling and hero. And so they overcome the impossible task, and it allows them to fulfill their destiny and be who they are. And again, I think all of us are foundlings. We're all sons and daughters of God, but we're raised down here on the earth, and we're yearning to fulfill. You see, Luke, I think it's interesting because a lot of people say that they're existentialists. You think of Sartre or Camus. And the easiest way to explain existentialism is existence precedes essence. In other words, we're born an absolute blank slate and we make up everything as we go along. But I got to argue, Luke, that almost everybody, I mean, whether they're religious, atheists, I don't care what they are, all of us have this deep sense, deeply woven sense that we have a purpose or a mission or an essence, and we're not going to be fulfilled unless we figure out what that calling is. I don't care if people say they're existentialists. I think all of us have a sense that we have a destiny that we need to fulfill. And so much of myth is about that. And I think that's one of the reasons we're drawn towards myth, because it will help us fulfill who we were meant to be.
So we have these ancient stories from all kinds of civilizations down through time, which often have underneath them this common thread. One obvious question this raises is, why do we see the same stories keep coming up? Now, Lewis, Dr. Marcos, I've heard about a very history-making conversation between J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and for many people, all you have to say is Addison's Walk, and they'll start nodding their heads. So would you describe this conversation, this pivotal event which changed C.S. Lewis from an atheist to a theist, and then a year later taking one more step into full Christianity?
Thanks for asking me, Luke. That is one of my favorite stories. One of my recent books is called The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes. And I got that title, The Myth Made Fact, from the story I'm about to tell you. Now, a lot of people know that Lewis was an atheist who became a Christian, but you already intimated a lot of people don't realize it was a two-step process for Lewis. First, at about the age of 30, he became a theist, a believer in God. But he still resisted this rather wild notion that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. What held him back from that, having already come to believe in God? Well, in Lewis's day, the Joseph Campbell of his day was a man named Sir James Fraser. And Fraser wrote a book called The Golden Bough. And like Campbell, he was sort of a comparative anthropologist or a comparative mythographer who looked at the stories and legends of myths of cultures across time and place, looking for commonalities. And Fraser, in The Golden Bough, discovered something he called the Corn King. He said the Corn God, but today we tend to say the Corn King. And the Corn King is a mythic archetype that appears again and again. It's the story of a son of the god who comes down to the earth, lives here, dies some kind of violent death, and then returns to the heavens. Now, it's not literally a resurrection. What this is a cyclical story of the seasons of life, death, and rebirth. So they come down, they die, and they're reborn each spring. And there are rituals tied to this, so that if you're an Egyptian, your corn king is named Osiris. If you're Greek, you call him Adonis or Bacchus. If you're Babylonian, you call him Tammuz. If you're Persian, you call him Mithras. If you're a Norseman, you call him Balder. In many ways, some of the stories of the avatarams of Vishnu in Hinduism also fit. Krishna and Rama also fit the story of the dying and rising God. Well, Lewis loved this story, but he said, what's this thing with Jesus? He's just the corn king myth of the Hebrews. What do I care about a rabbi that died 2,000 years ago? What does that have to do with me today? Well, Addison's Walk is a beautiful tree-lined walk on the grounds of Magdalen College, Oxford University, where Lewis taught. And one evening, while he and J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a very strong believing Catholic, were walking around Addison's Walk, and as they strolled, they discussed this very issue. And then Tolkien said to Lewis, did you ever wonder, maybe the reason that Jesus sounds like a myth is because he was the myth that became fact, or the myth that was made fact. And within a week, Lewis had come to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Now, what does this mean, the myth made fact? Well, let's look at this. We've been talking about the deep effect of myths on all people across the world. Why is it that all people in all different cultures and different times have this yearning for this archetypal myth of a God that comes to earth and dies and returns? Well, I would say the only answer to that is if there is a single creator, he put that desire in all of us. Because Luke, I'm also a big fan of Jung. Jung talks about the collective unconscious, but where does that come from? Just because you give it a name doesn't just mean it happens, right? I believe there is a collective unconscious, but I think the only way that's possible is if we were all made in the image of the same creator. Otherwise, the stories wouldn't be so close. They would be very different. Well, if you're a Christian, as I am, then you believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah who fulfilled the Old Testament law and prophets. But what Tolkien taught Lewis, and also taught me, is that Jesus not only fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament, he fulfilled the highest yearnings of the pagan peoples. Because you know what? If Jesus came into the world and he answered the Jewish yearning, but he had nothing to say to the other 99% of humanity, it would be as if a foreign god had invaded us. But in fact, what we see is that Jesus answers the desire of all the nations. He is not only the Messiah, he is the corn king in real history, in real time and place. How's that for a story, Luke?
That's excellent. Now, I do want to get one point of clarification. You referred to this corn king. Corn is a reference to wheat, if I'm not mistaken.
Now you're in Canada. Do you also say corn for wheat in Canada as the British do?
No. No, we have corn and we have wheat, but not...
Okay, you're Americanized, yes. Now, that's a good question. My specialty is the 19th century. And in the Victorian age, they passed all sorts of things calling corn laws. But they actually were there to regulate the buying and selling of wheat, not corn, which the British call maize.
Yeah, and so again, this was just a point of clarification, but I do want to come back to what you were saying about these ideas being put into humans, the idea that we were imprinted with them, perhaps even as far back as when our ancestors were evolving in Africa, beginning to pull together stories, symbolism and that sort of thing, and then migrated out into Europe. Is it a built-in knowledge? Is it almost like an instinct? You know, migratory birds and monarch butterflies, they have this built-in knowledge or instinct to, and with a complete navigation system too, to fly thousands of miles. It's just, they're born with it. Is this something similar here with humans and myth-making? And I'm recalling a verse in the Bible as we speak now, that God's put eternity into the heart of man. Is this what we're talking about?
It is. And going along wonderfully with that beautiful passage from Ecclesiastes is a phrase very well known from the beginning of the Confessions, where St. Augustine says, "O Lord, you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Or Pascal spoke of us as having a God-shaped vacuum, right? There's something in us. I think we are naturally myth-making animals. We not only make up myths, we want to be part of that story, part of the myth. But here's the big difference, Luke. We are conscious creatures. We have consciousness and conscience. We are moral, ethical creatures in a way animals aren't. So the bird has the natural homing instinct, but the bird does not choose whether to follow it or not. I believe we are hardwired with the myth, but as volitional creatures made in the imago Dei, the image of God, we can choose, I believe, whether we're going to be the hero or the villain, whether we're going to be the foundling or the Byronic hero. So we look at the myth, but we choose whether we are going to follow it or we are going to violate it, whether we're going to ignore it or we're going to learn from it. So I do think, truly, I do think it is sort of instinctual. And yet we can't shake them. The best example is in episode 1, 2, and 3, George Lucas, he decided he wanted to be politically correct, whatever you want to say. And he's got this scene in episode 3 where they say, well, the Sith Lords, right? The dark side, the Sith Lord is given to absolutist thinking. So it's almost like he wants to make fun of people who believe that there's actually a real goodness, truth, and beauty out there. But the archetype of Star Wars is so powerful, Lucas could not do that. His own myth defeated him because later on, when the evil emperor, Sidious, is trying to tell Anakin Skywalker to bend things, he's like, well, isn't that wrong? And he says, well, the truth is malleable. So if you actually watch carefully, even though Lucas wants to trick us into thinking that the bad guys are the absolutists, it's actually the good guys who have an absolute understanding of right and wrong, virtue and vice. He can't break out of his own myth because those are the myths that are hardwired in us. That's why the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is very, very secular, it ends, with Endgame. Maybe that's where they should have ended, but it ends with Endgame with the most narcissistic of all the superheroes, Captain Iron Man, ends up sacrificing himself in a myth that is truly sort of messianic. I think the myths have a certain groove that they want to go in, and they're written deeply in us, and we try to reject them, but they come back.
Yeah. There's another myth theme that I've detected, and I wonder if this is also what you're talking about, a borderline messianic theme. The idea of a super race of beings that create humans and then try to lure them back home. The humans have gone off, and then these super beings try to bring them back home. So I'm thinking of movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey or Prometheus, the sequel to the Aliens franchise. Contact with Jodie Foster, that's very much a theme there, a movie that was very influential on me. Is that also one of these themes that you're referring to?
Well, what's interesting, Contact was, of course, written by Carl Sagan, very much a secular human. It's not very secular person. And yet I think he understood that natural yearning. Now, here's something that you might not have connected, Luke. Another book that does that, believe it or not, is the Silmarillion, the prequel to the Lord of the Rings, because the Valar, who are the angelic beings that work with God, Eru or Iluvatar, they create the elves and then they create men. It's really God, but through their agency. And part of the problem is that they're lonely and they want the elves to come to them out in the west, what's called Valinor. And in some ways, they won't let them grow up. It's very interesting. There's this strange, we go away and we want to come back. We are creatures meant, John Locke said that the reason we gather together in groups is scarcity. Now, there's some truth to that, but that also leads to a kind of Marxism, where I would say as a Christian that the reason we naturally seek community is we were made in the image of a triune God, a God who is his own community. And so I think it's natural for us. Of course, we gather together to support each other. I mean, there is a truth to scarcity, but there's something deeper, right? In other words, yes, we have instincts like animals, but there's something that overrides those instincts and is more powerful and cannot be explained merely by neurons firing and brains and physical things. There's something beyond that. There's mind as well as matter, soul as well as body, spirit as well as flesh. There is something that rises us above and puts in us a yearning. And again, I think that comes across in our myths, wherever those myths are from. They're there and they're very strong and they're hardwired. And we too want to go home. G.K. Chesterton said, we're all like Robinson Crusoe. We know we're adrift, right? And we're trying to survive in this world, but we also want to get home.
Right. It's interesting you brought up the image of God, the Imago Dei. I did want to ask you a question about that, and this is the perfect time. It fits into this overall thesis that we've been exploring over the past 4 months, the whole idea that God creates a universe with the purpose of producing agape-capable beings. And so we talked about various biochemical and cognitive evolutionary steps that brought us closer to being capable of this agape love. But what we're talking about here, this is I think it fits in, but it's a bit more interventionist. Those biochemical and cognitive pathways sort of were self-evolving, but this is something that I think is a bit more top-down. This would require God putting something into us, giving us some kind of a data or programming, the bare outlines of these themes that we see myths crystallizing around. And so I'm wondering, is that part of that whole thesis we've been exploring, this Imago Dei? Is this another way to see the Imago Dei?
Yes, there's a moment at which we become sentient beings. So that humanity, when we think of the full human being, we are not an evolution, we are a revolution. Right there is it's another way to put this, Luke. It's not a quantitative difference. It's not like our brain gets bigger and then a little bigger and then a little bigger and then suddenly we're human. It is qualitative. There is a leap in there. And we're talking now not only about a leap in terms of functionality, we're talking about a totally different creature. human beings who have consciousness, conscience, will, volition, a sense of beauty, a sense of right and wrong. There's something wholly other there that's qualitatively different. There is a leap. And before that, maybe we're a hominid in terms of the shape of our body, right? But we're not human until that qualitative leap takes place.
Right. Now, you're using the word revolution, and I think we're on the same page, but I wanted to check if we are thinking the same thing. For example, we see in human history technology rising exponentially. Once you have a few discoveries, you can build on top of that other discoveries, which catalyze other discoveries. And so you see this exponential rise in technology. So I asked you then, this idea of the top-down approach that God is taking here, he gives us some basic data, some simple programming, and as I said earlier, the bare outlines of the themes that we see myths crystallizing around. These ideas that all civilizations just begin to pack their own interpretations, which then lead to other interpretations, and you get a whole unpacking of a myth story and eventually a religion from that.
That is good, right? The initial impulse is put in there. The yearning, the God-shaped vacuum written eternally in the hearts of men. There is something in there that we yearn for something. Okay, do you know that Tolkien spoke of death, mortality, as God's gift to men? In his Lord of the Rings, you have to read the whole thing. They call it legendarium. Yep. They call it today the full thing. And why is it? Because, the elves, a lot of people misunderstand this. The elves are immortal, but they're not eternal. They live on and on and on, the elves, but their life is tied to Arda, what Tolkien's word for the earth. And when the earth is gone, they're gone as well. That's why they're always melancholy and nostalgic, because there's no ultimate hope for them. But we will escape from the confines of this world. And in a weird way, mortality is a gift because we will not be forever bound to the cycles. We will escape and move on. And I think those things are written deep inside of us, that we yearn for something beyond. We know that we're part of a meta-narrative. Now, it's really ironic because the word meta-narrative was invented by postmodern people who don't actually believe there's a meta-narrative. That's very ironic. But people that believe in it, we've picked up on that phrase, right? And it's just like the people that invented our anthropic principle, that when you look at the fine-tuning of the universe, every single thing in the universe is geared to make sentient life like us. But the people that invented that actually don't believe in that. They believe anything's chance, right? But I've taken that word as well. It's just kind of funny. So what I'm saying is they desire it, they yearn for it. And the meta-narrative, that's the overarching story. It's the story of creation, fall, redemption, reconciliation, restoration, glorification. It's the overall, the huge story arc that we're part of. I wonder what kind of a story we've fallen into, Mr. Frodo, is what Sam says to Frodo in Lord of the Rings. And I do think that story is hardwired into, it's part of what it means to be human. So you know what? Even if your pet was with you in heaven, the pet does not have an unbroken consciousness. Even if it was in heaven, it wouldn't know that it was, Spot, right? But we are and this is so powerful because, Luke, for people today, especially, somebody that's an academic that, so to speak, lives by their mind, nothing terrifies us more than Alzheimer's. Because if I lose my memory, am I no longer myself? The wonderful thing, and almost everybody can attest to this, that has taken care of a grandmother or grandfather with Alzheimer's. Even when they've forgotten everything, there are those sudden moments of lucidity when suddenly you see the person is still there. The person may be hidden and covered over, but they're still there deep down. And people that do that wonderful music therapy, suddenly they'll hear a song from when they grew up in the 30s, and suddenly there's a lucidity. So the person's there. It's not gone. It's just that we are enfleshed souls. And so what happens to our body affects our soul and vice versa. That's who we are, that as creatures. That's who we are ontologically speaking.
It's interesting. You mentioned music. That was a question I was going to ask you about. I thought it would be outside of your area of expertise, but it sounds like you might have been thinking about this. It's our love for music, and more importantly, how music can move us so deeply, so emotionally, and sometimes even so intellectually. It elevates our thinking. So we have this built-in connection between music and emotion. Is that related to this built-in myth-making machinery in some way? Are songs abbreviated versions of myths?
It's interesting because music is, now, when I say music, I mean classical music without lyrics. Again, something that's just pure music. That seems to be the most universal language. I think when they did studies, they said Mozart speaks to everybody, including somebody from a tribal group in the middle of Africa. They have a direct reaction to this music that speaks to us at a deep level without words. That's why I think it's the most unmediated. It's the most direct. It's seemingly the most spontaneous. And I think that we do connect with it. We find that in folk music, even when there are lyrics in a certain language, the folk music just seems to speak of it seems to speak simultaneously of the struggles and glories and victories of a people, but also of the whole human race at the same time. I think we get that very deep in there. So my daughter teaches music, and they sometimes use the Kodai method. It looks like Kodali, but it's pronounced Kodai. And this is a person that teaches music through folk tunes and folk songs. And that's a way to get deeply to the level of the child and allow them to participate in the music. And I think there's just something beautiful about that.
Right.
And so, yes, music is a universal language, just as myth. That's why, of course, I'm glad we have sound movies now. But when silent movies reached their apex of perfection, they were a universal language that just speaks directly. And even when you need to put subtitles, they're in your language. But, the Germans got to a point where they almost didn't even need any subtitles. It was such a pure visual language. One of the first international beloved stars was Charlie Chaplin. Somehow he spoke to everybody through those silent films. And again, I think myth touches on the same deep story, I guess.
So do you think this is a form of divine inspiration? Divine inspiration, we sometimes have this idea that it always involves God giving us words, the specific words and the ideas, but it can also involve giving us a hunger for truth and meaning, and maybe pointing us in the right direction, like those migrating birds and butterflies, and motivating us, or at least those of us who take the time to contemplate life and meaning. It compels us to search for an answer or answers.
It is interesting. And, one of the elements of theology, people debate this, with Calvinism, Arminianism, Catholicism. But actually, if you read the real theologians, basically all denominations of Christianity believe in what's called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace. That's the grace that comes before grace. That's the grace that wakes us up to that yearning and that desire and that need. And then after that, different Christians have slightly different ways of how it works out. But we have to be woken up in the beginning, woken up to our need. See, look, I said that to a certain extent, the ancient Greeks and Romans don't have a Judeo-Christian understanding of sin, because you can't really understand sin unless you have a holy God to measure that sin against. And yet, as Rene Girard and so many people have shown us, the ancient people, even though they have gods that are, not moral at all, have that sense of what we still call today taboo, that there are certain crimes that bring a ritual impurity that needs to be taken care of. And it's often taken care of by the corn king, the dying and rising god. So, obviously like Oedipus, the patricide and incest are, again, even for pagans that don't have an absolute, monotheistic sense of holiness, of right and wrong, they understand that this is something that disrupts the story, disrupts who we are, and calls out for some kind of reconciliation that usually involves something divine. And again, it always brings us back to the corn king. That's why it's such an appealing myth that we're drawn towards.
Right. So on that note, I want to get a little bit more personal here with you, Lewis. What convinces you that all of these ancient myths and religions point forward to this one person, Jesus Christ? That he's the fulfillment of not just ancient Hebrew prophecy, but also all those ancient pagan myths of heroes and rescue missions and reconciliations?
Again, what's interesting about all the myths is that they're not really historical. It doesn't make a difference when they took place. Nobody really cares. And that's even true in Hinduism with the various avatars of Vishnu. coming down as Rama and all these different people. It doesn't make a difference when it happened because it's only the idea that saves. And it's the idea that fills us with the longing. But Christianity is different. As Lewis said, it happens in a real time and a real place under Pontius Pilate. He says it's all in order. It happens now and it's real and it's within history. And there is this incredible thing called the resurrection, which can be historically verified better than almost any event from the ancient world. So everything that's why Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton, they love to refer to Christianity, and I do as well, as a true myth. Now that kind of scares my Baptist colleagues, right? But it's a true myth. It's a myth because it speaks to the deep yearnings. It's about origins, beginnings. It's about telos, or where we're going, endings and things, right? It's all of those things, but it also happens to be something that happened in real time and real space. In fact, in the Western world, we still speak of BC and AD. And there are some people that like to be, politically correct and say BCE and C, but it doesn't make a difference. We're recognizing that that's the hinge of history. And you know what? Again, Christians particularly, we debate about how old the earth is, whatnot. Okay, to me, it doesn't make a difference how old the earth is, right? But here's the interesting thing. I do accept the literal flood and Babel, okay? But we really can't date those things. But you know what we can date, Luke, is Abraham. The actual direct work that God is doing in human history begins with Abraham. And Abraham is 2000 BC. The fact is that this very direct working in human history is only 4,000 years old, with Christ coming literally at the center. I don't know if that means the second coming is tomorrow, Luke, okay? But we're kind of on a hinge right here. The point I'm getting at is that we are very much a part of this story that is not that old, this sort of redemption story, whatever you want to call it. This story is not that old. And our part of it is very, very, again, I wonder what kind of story we've fallen into. Don't the great stories never end, Master Frodo? It's the same story. If you read the Silmarillion, they're all part of this same story going on. And I think that speaks to us because I think we realize that we're part of that story. And that gives us hope, and it gives us meaning, and it gives us purpose.
And I just wanted to push a little bit further into this because there's a lot of myths, and by that I mean, how people might use the word myths traditionally. There's a lot of stories of the dying, rising hero figure. And then you said that this one point that you see Christianity as the true myth because it happened in real history, in real time, and people could see what was happening. There are lots of stories of the dying hero, but what we haven't seen is a dying, rising hero, except Christians would say in this one case. Is that part of the reason why you say this is the fulfillment of all those myths, that we have a dying, rising king, and this happened on the world stage, and people could look into this and test it and show it?
Exactly. And I would add that it happened once for all. Because again, even though we speak of the Corn King as dying and rising, it is ultimately cyclical. They keep dying and rising. There's no breaking out of it. But here, it happened once and for all time. The sacrifice is once and for all, and it's done with. The resurrection is not just a resuscitation. It is going through death and coming out on the other side in a glorified, perfected, resurrected body. You know what scares people more than anything? Are ghosts and zombies. Why? Because a ghost is a soul without a body, and a zombie is a body without a soul. And that is why death is never natural to us. Because see again, I love reading these cognitive people. What was that guy's name? The man who mistook his wife for a hat? Just went out of my mind.
I don't know that.
Oliver Sacks.
Oh, of course, yes.
He wrote Awakenings. Anyway, a lot of these folks are trying to basically disprove the soul, because they show us that when we have some kind of terrible close head injury, we sort of lose ourselves or lose our memories or become different. These people don't understand that, at least in Christianity, nobody ever said we're a soul trapped in a body. That's what Plato thought and the ancient Greeks. We say that we are enfleshed souls. In other words, Luke, I am not half soul and half body, or half physical and half spiritual. I am fully physical and fully spiritual. I am an incarnational being. Now, for Christians, Jesus is incarnate because he's fully God and fully man. That's not what I am. But I, like all people, are fully spiritual and fully physical. So whatever happens to my brain is going to affect my mind because we are one. And again, I tell you, Luke, one of my very favorite movies of all, I teach film as well. I love It's a Wonderful Life. Great, great movie. But it has perpetuated this myth that has never been taught in Christianity, that when we die, we become angels. Angels are a totally different creation. They're fully spiritual in the way that an animal is fully physical. I mean, it has a personality, but it's still physical. We are the great amphibians of the universe, fully physical, fully spiritual, fully body, fully soul. And that is who we are ontologically, and that will persist beyond the grave. That's the great story of the resurrection. It is, again, a qualitative change, that we will have a body that will never decay, that will be immortal.
And just for those of the listeners who aren't, such as yourself, an English literature, English language scholar, or myself, a biologist, when you say we're all amphibians, amphibian means two kinds of life forms, bi life forms. And you're referring to the fact that amphibians are one kind of an animal in one part of their life and then become They reconfigure their entire body and become a different kind of animal. That's what you're getting at.
And they can live in the water and on land, just as we are physical. But you're right. They also, and of course, if you think about a butterfly, one of the examples they used throughout the story for the resurrection is the butterfly. Now, I'll just tell you this because this is very funny. Clement, who's one of the really early church fathers, he wrote about 95, and nobody seems to dispute that. Clement wrote the letter to Corinth. In it, to describe the resurrection, he tells the story of the phoenix. And we've all heard of that. There's only one phoenix. It lives 500 years. At the end of its life, it builds a pyre. It falls, it immolates, it burns to nothing. But then out of the ashes rises a new phoenix. Now, I've read a lot of people who want to make fun of Clement for being so credulous as to believe in the phoenix. Luke, if you had never heard of a butterfly, and I explained to you that there was this worm thing that put itself into a cocoon and then basically died and came out this lighter than air creature with colorful wings, you would think I lost my mind, wouldn't you? Come on. Now, I'm not saying I think there's a phoenix, but what I'm saying is there are wonders in nature that are unbelievable. And the butterfly is the closest. So we got the amphibian. We can live in both places, physical and spiritual, right? But we're also, like the butterfly, something wholly other. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing story, but I think it speaks to us. Like I said, it's not just, we're never going to forget that person. It is that we persist in a perfected form. And we need to understand, in terms of Christian theology now, Luke, that when Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, when he accepted, whatever that means, when he accepted the incarnation to become man, he wasn't accepting something for 33 years, for all of time, because in Christian theology, Jesus is still fully God and fully man. He did not go back to being pure spirit like God the Father or the Holy Spirit. He is and will forever be in a resurrection body, but we think his will be the only one with scars, the stigmata. Ours will be perfect. I mean, we just got to, this is just so much more exciting that, because for many Christians I grew up with, salvation means getting to get a get out of hell free card. Okay. Well, that's kind of nice. I mean, I'm not saying that's bad, but we're talking about a whole lot more than that. We're talking about transformation. We're talking about transfiguration or metamorphosis, something that is the true culmination and summation and consummation of everything that came before.
Right.
That's the myth.
So these words that you just used, transformation, transfiguration, and when I asked in the context, what can give us conviction that, as you say, that Jesus is that true myth that all these other ancient myths find fulfillment in, it sounds like a missing ingredient is this idea of the resurrection. I think I need to do an episode on that. But I think there still will be people in the audience who are a bit more skeptical. So I have this question that they might be asking. Lewis, as a scholar in the humanities, you must be familiar with, and sometimes painfully so, this bias in modern society that it has towards scientism, that Many seem to think there's only one mode of thinking, only scientism, where you can arbitrarily dispense with an idea if it can't be measured or tested or proven, and I have proven in air quotes there. Scholars such as yourself would argue that that's not the only path toward truth, that another equally valid path to truth involves imagination or faith or intuition, things like philosophy and theology and religion. What would you say for that?
There is such a world of difference between science and scientism. First of all, just really quickly, Luke, I just have to mention this. Why did science pop up in the West and nowhere else? The Chinese invented things long before we did, but China did not create science as we know it. And we did. This is finally being rehabilitated and recaptured. The original, early modern scientists were either Christians or strong theists. Now, why is that important? They believed, whether it was Copernicus or Galileo or Newton, they believed that the universe was created by a God of order and balance and beauty and harmony, and that harmony is in the world, and that creator gave us senses that we can use to perceive that. In Hinduism or Buddhism, finally, nature is Maya. It's illusion. Our senses deceive us. They needed to have faith that if they studied the universe, they would find the principles on which it was built. Just like we don't invent math, we discover math. The formulas are already there, and we discover them. As Newton said, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. You know this, Luke. One of the criteria that your physics statement that it's true is the more elegant it is, the more likely it is to be true. That wouldn't be the case in a universe that's completely random, right? So we look at it and we can discern these laws of nature. If we didn't believe that we could trust our senses or that there was order, we wouldn't look for it. So it's very strange. So suddenly along comes scientism and says it's basically radical empiricism on quaaludes, we would have said when I was a kid. Right? If you can't see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, it doesn't exist. I hate to laugh about this, Luke, but I watch these specials all the time where somebody shows a graph of the brain and they show, we now understand what part of our brain lights up when we're in love. Now I understand love. And I just want to, what do you mean you understand love? I mean, you have no idea what you're talking about. So science can answer some very, very important questions. What it can't answer are the final questions, the transcendental questions, the why questions. I don't know. Science, true science, should lead to a sense of awe and wonder, telling us what we do know and what we don't know, so that we're full of awe and wonder, rather than a scientism that is reductive. It's like the difference between history and historicism. Historicism is a reductive thing that says we are complete products of our socioeconomic historical milieu, and we can't break from it. That's not. History allows us to study the story that we're part of and understand our role and function. So science, they should not be enemies. Science and faith and reason. John Paul II wrote a book called Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. They're the two wings of the eagle that allow it to soar. And so we need science, but scientism reduces it.
Right. And I like how you put that a moment ago, that science should bring us to a point of awe. And then the next step is that leap of faith, that imaginative step where we use our imagination to connect some dots. And I've heard this phrase, we run the ramp of reason before we take the leap of faith.
And you've probably heard the story that E equals MC squared was just something that sort of came to Einstein intuitively. Then he spent the rest of his life trying to prove it. And the same thing with Newton. Okay, everybody knows the story of the apple falling in his head. Okay, that doesn't mean, there's gravity. I mean, everybody knows things fall down. What happened was, as I've read it and understand it, is when the apple fell from the tree and hit him, he suddenly had an imaginative leap and said, maybe the relationship between the top of the tree and the bottom of the tree is like the relationship between the sun and the moon and the other star. It was an imaginative leap to help him understand the movement of bodies in space and how they can affect each other and all that stuff. And by the way, people don't know, Galileo thought the reason for the tides was because the earth was spinning. He even didn't figure out that the moon was a hunk of rock 250,000 miles above us, has enough of a tiny gravitational pull that it allows some crazy boy in California to ride the waves.
Yep.
I mean, it's just amazing that we live in a sympathetic universe, right? And it's the beauty of it there. You know, that there's a guy named Michael Polanyi that has tried to go back to this understanding that our perceptions of nature have an effect on nature. Now, I know to some people that sounds like, oh, you're being relativistic, but no, it's understanding the kind of universe we live in and the kind of creatures we are, that there's an objective element and a subjective element. There's a great book called Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield, who had a profound influence on Lewis especially, but also on Tolkien. And to understand the nature of the universe we live in and the mystery of it. And how much of the universe is dark matter and dark energy, Luke?
It's
a huge
dark matter.
percentage.
It's a huge percentage of what we believe is out there. Yes.
No, but we think that because we have a name for it, we understand it. Wonderful, isn't it? So we come back to wonder, and that was it. Socrates said that knowledge begins with wonder.
Right.
That's where wisdom and knowledge begin, with wonder. And we need to get back and stop thinking we have look. The best way to end this: The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is one of the Chronicles of Narnia. And it features a character named Eustace Clarence Scrubb. And he almost deserved it, Lewis says. He is a product of modern education, no imagination, no wonder. And he changes during the course. But at one point, he meets a magician, a wizard named Ramandu. And it turns out that Ramandu is a star. Because in Narnia, the stars are human, so to speak, and they come down to rest. Okay, when Eustace hears that Ramandu is a star, he says, oh my sir, where I come from, a star is just a flaming ball of gas. To which Ramandu answers, no, my son, even in your world, that is not what a star is. That's only what a star is made of. Mm-hmm. And we think that because we understand what we're made of, we understand who we are. Luke, I am made up of so much bone and flesh and sinew and internal organs and all sorts of nasty stuff. But I hope that's not who I am. I hope who I am is somewhat different than the sum of my parts. What was it 100 years ago when they talked about how if you boiled us down, the chemicals of our body would get about 250 on the market? I'm trying to remember that. It was a famous, infamous thing. I can't remember the exact number, but that's why, for instance, people wonder why Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, the most logical detective of all time, that he, at the end of his life, got all into spiritualism and automatic writing and seance. What the heck? Well, the reason his son, Adrian Conan Doyle, explained that, I saw it on a video. He said, we came back from World War I and all these people had died, an entire generation dead, all that sort of stuff. And we went to the church and asked them, will we see our relatives again? And at that point, the church had gotten so much into scientism, they had no answer. And so he said, they had nothing to say to us. So he gets caught up in science, in crazy stuff, because he knows that there is a spiritual part of us. Will we persist? Is our soul immortal? What will happen? We can't just stop asking these questions. If we do, we cease to be human.
Right.
And scientism can only stop us from asking the questions, but it doesn't answer them or point in the right direction. I remember when all the Big Bang was coming out, one scientist who was a very secular person, you might remember his name, it just went out of it, but he said, it's like a crazy story. It's as if a group of scientists were climbing up a mountain, slowly reaching up with all their scientific method. And finally, they pulled themselves up to the top of the mountain and they found a bunch of priests sitting there.
Yeah, theologians, yes.
The name of the guy, you'll remember, but from the 20th century.
Yes, yeah.
An interesting person.
The author's name would be Robert Jastrow.
And again, we need draw these things together, right? They speak to us on both levels, and we want to learn these things. But again, that's how science was born, out of a belief that the order is there. We just need to search for it.
Okay, so there's a lot more that we could talk about, but we have run over time. Before we let you go, I want to find out more about what you're doing, if there's projects in the works that our listeners might want to see.
I think they would really enjoy The Myth Made Fact, reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian. If you look at my name, Louis Markos, it's Markos, it's a Greek name. And if you go to my Amazon author page, you'll see that. I wrote another book I think you might be interested in, From Plato to Christ, How Platonic Thought Shaped the Christian Faith. And I've got all sorts of books on Lewis and Tolkien and things. I've even got a book called Heaven and Hell, Visions of the Afterlife in the Western Poetic Tradition. So I'm always working in that interface with Athens and Jerusalem and trying to build bridges, because we really need, and I should say I wish I had time to talk about Jordan Peterson, but I'm a big fan of what he's doing up in Canada and trying to build bridges and, help us to understand myth and how that myth is a map or a guide for our life.
Right. Okay. Well, Lewis, it has been great. I can hear the passion in your voice as you're speaking. You have a lot of ideas, but you have a lot of passion behind them as well. And I have been so glad that you've come on here to share your thoughts on this whole idea of the true myth.
Thanks so much. Love to come back.
We will talk again. Lewis, have a great day.
Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com or leave them at our YouTube channel. Same name, same logo. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.